The vacuum of space rippled with tension as the Zarn interceptor's gravitational drives locked onto the TSV Maverick. Razor-sharp sensor beams probed the human vessel's hull, searching for the slightest vulnerability. Commander Sarah Chen stood motionless on the bridge, her augmented eyes reflecting a holographic matrix of potential scenarios that would make most species' neural networks collapse from sheer computational stress. Incoming transmission, announced AI, the ship's quantum adaptive AI. The voice was simultaneously mechanical and sardonic, a perfect representation of human technological innovation. The Zarn boarding team materialized with practiced precision, their crystalline exoskeletons gleaming under the ship's adaptive lighting. Lead Inspector Xital believed this would be a routine inspection. Humans were notorious for their technological inconsistency, always dancing on the razor's edge of galactic regulations. What Xital didn't know was that the Maverick was anything but routine. The cargo hold seemed normal at first glance, shipping containers neatly arranged, cargo manifests projected in holographic displays. But normality was the first layer of the trap. As the Zarn inspectors began their initial sweep, the room began to subtly change. Holographic projections flickered to life, each one a labyrinthine document of such complexity that it bordered on art. Legal citations from a dozen different star systems intertwined, creating a visual representation of bureaucratic complexity that would make even the most seasoned administrative AI weep. Initiating standard cargo verification protocol, announced the lead inspector, his multifaceted eyes scanning the containers. The first container opened, and that's when everything changed. Instead of a simple cargo manifest, a cascading wall of text erupted. Thousands of pages of documentation materialized simultaneously, each one a perfect, technically accurate representation of interstellar shipping regulations. But these were no ordinary documents. They were living, breathing legal entities that seemed to pulse with an almost sentient energy. The Zarn inspector's neural implants began to overheat. Each line of text was a mathematical puzzle, a regulatory challenge that defied standard computational logic. The documents weren't just information. They were a weapon. Commander Chen watched from the bridge, a slight smile playing across her lips. This was why humans were feared across the galaxy, not for their weapons, but for their absolutely terrifying ability to turn bureaucracy into a form of warfare. Araya's voice cut through the growing chaos. Regulatory defense protocol activated, initiating comprehensive documentation sequence. The cargo hold transformed. Walls began to shift, displaying complex legal diagrams that seemed to move and breathe. Each movement was a perfect, technically compliant reconfiguration that violated every known principle of spatial design. The Zarn team found themselves walking through a living legal argument, where every step triggered a new regulatory challenge. Inspector Xital's primary communication node began to spark. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Humans had done the impossible. They had weaponized paperwork. Impossible, the inspector managed to vocalize, his crystalline form beginning to vibrate with computational stress. This violates sections 7.3, 12.9, and... His voice was cut off as another wave of documentation crashed over him. The Maverick wasn't just a ship. It was a mobile legal fortress, a vessel that could defend itself with nothing more than perfectly crafted sentences and regulatory citations. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what would happen next. The Zarn interceptor hung motionless, its crew watching in growing horror as their boarding team was consumed by a tsunami of human bureaucratic creativity. Commander Sarah Chen allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. This was why humanity had survived. Not through brute force, but through an unparalleled ability to turn complexity into a weapon. AI, she whispered, prepare full regulatory defense protocol. Let's show them what humans can do. The ship hummed in response, a sound that was part mechanical, part something else entirely. The challenge had begun, and the Maverick was just getting started. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez wasn't just an administrative officer. He was a weaponized information architect. His fingers danced across quantum-entangled interfaces, each movement releasing a new layer of bureaucratic complexity that would make even the most hardened galactic regulators weep. The Maverick's internal systems began to pulse with a rhythm that was part mathematical algorithm, part living organism. Rodriguez watched as the regulatory defense swarm activated, hundreds of microdrones lifting from their concealed compartments like a metallic cloud of legal precision. AI. He called to the ship's AI. Initiate adaptive reconfiguration protocol. The ship responded instantly. The microdrones began their work, each one carrying a different section of interstellar law, cosmic trade regulations, and administrative precedents from thousands of star systems. They weren't just technological devices, they were mobile legal entities, each programmed with an impossible level of regulatory complexity. Zarn inspectors found themselves caught in a nightmare of spatial reorganization. Corridors that existed moments ago dissolved and reformed. Walls shifted with mathematical precision, creating pathways that were simultaneously compliant and impossible. Each movement was a perfect, technically accurate reconfiguration that violated every known principle of ship design. Inspector Xatel's secondary neural processor began to overheat. The human vessel defied every computational model in the Zarn's extensive database. Where other species sought a ship, humans had created a living legal argument, a mobile fortress of bureaucratic warfare. Rodriguez smiled. This was humanity's true weapon. The ability to transform the mundane into something extraordinary. The microdrones continued their work. Some projected holographic legal citations that hung in the air like three-dimensional spider webs. Others began to rewrite the ship's internal architectural plans in real time, creating spaces that existed in a quantum state of regulatory compliance. Spatial anomaly detected, Araya announced, her voice a perfect blend of clinical precision and sardonic humor. Regulatory compliance at 287% efficiency. Warning: excessive legal complexity may cause systemic cognitive breakdown. The Zarn team's communication systems began to fragment. Each attempt to understand the ship's layout triggered a cascade of legal interpretations. Was this a cargo vessel? A research station? A mobile administrative center? The more they tried to classify it, the more the Maverick resisted classification. Rodriguez knew the true power wasn't in the technology, but in the human capacity for creative interpretation. The microdrones weren't just reconfiguring space, they were challenging the very concept of spatial and regulatory understanding. A particularly ambitious drone projected an entire legal brief directly into the neural interfaces of the Zarn inspectors. It wasn't just information, it was a weaponized argument that challenged their entire understanding of interstellar law. Clauses twisted and reformed, creating logical paradoxes that threatened to overload their cognitive systems. "Impossible," muttered one of the Zarn inspectors, his crystalline form beginning to vibrate with computational stress. "No vessel can be this complex." But the Maverick was no ordinary vessel. It was a statement, a challenge, a living proof of humanity's most terrifying capability, turning bureaucracy into an art form of resistance. The ship's internal systems continued to shift. What had begun as a simple boarding inspection had transformed into a battle of pure information. The Zarn team found themselves walking through corridors that were simultaneously legal arguments, technological marvels, and impossible geometric constructions. Rodriguez's fingers never stopped moving. Each gesture sent another wave of regulatory complexity through the ship's systems. The microdrones continued their dance, rewriting the very definition of what a spaceship could be. "AI," he whispered, "maintain maximum bureaucratic pressure." The AI responded with a cascade of holographic documentation that would make even the most seasoned legal expert question their understanding of reality. Walls became arguments. Corridors transformed into living legal briefs. The Maverick was no longer just a ship. It was a mobile philosophical challenge. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to hold its breath. The Zarn interceptor hung motionless, its crew watching in growing horror as their boarding team was consumed by a tsunami of human administrative creativity. This was humanity's true strength, not brute force, not technological superiority, but an unparalleled ability to turn complexity into a weapon, to transform the most mundane of human inventions, bureaucracy, into something extraordinary. The adaptive response had begun, and the Zarn had no idea what was coming next. The Zarn communication network began to fracture like brittle glass, each transmission a potential weapon of mass administrative destruction. Commander Sarah Chen watched the developing chaos with a clinical precision that would have terrified her alien observers. What the Zarn didn't understand was that humans had transformed bureaucracy into the most subtle and devastating form of psychological warfare ever conceived in the known universe. Araya, the ship's advanced regulatory intelligence algorithm, was more than just an artificial intelligence. She was a living weapon of pure administrative complexity, her quantum processors capable of generating infinite variations of legal interpretations that would make even the most hardened cosmic bureaucrats weep. Initiating comprehensive communication saturation, Araya announced, her voice a perfect blend of clinical precision and barely contained excitement. The first wave hit like a tsunami of pure information. Thousands of communication channels erupted simultaneously, each carrying a different legal interpretation of the current boarding procedure. The Zarn's communication nodes began to overload, struggling to process the sheer volume and complexity of the incoming data. Some transmissions were straightforward shipping manifests. Others were intricate legal arguments that referenced obscure regulations from star systems that had ceased to exist millennia ago. A few were pure mathematical poetry, legal citations that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously true and false. Inspector Xadel's primary neural interface began to spark and crackle. The human vessel was doing something impossible. It wasn't just resisting inspection. It was fundamentally challenging the entire concept of regulatory compliance. Each transmission was a carefully crafted psychological trap. The legal citations weren't just text. They were living arguments that seemed to breathe and mutate. They referenced regulations that existed in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, creating logical paradoxes that threatened to tear apart the Zarn's rigid cognitive structures. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez watched the psychological warfare unfold with a scientist's detached fascination. Humans had discovered something profound. Information could be a weapon more devastating than any physical armament. "Observe," he muttered to a junior officer, "how we turn paperwork into psychological warfare." The ship's communication arrays continued their relentless assault. Some transmissions were deliberately contradictory, creating cognitive dissonance that threatened to fracture the Zarn inspector's understanding of reality. Others were so perfectly crafted that they existed in a state of absolute regulatory compliance while simultaneously violating every known principle of interstellar law. Araya wasn't just generating documents. She was creating a living, breathing legal ecosystem that defied comprehension. Each transmission was a puzzle, a challenge, a weapon disguised as administrative procedure. The Zarn team's neural interfaces began to overheat. They were experiencing something unprecedented, a form of information warfare that targeted the very core of their cognitive processing. Humans had transformed bureaucracy from a mundane administrative tool into a weapon of pure psychological devastation. Regulatory complexity increasing, Araya announced. Cognitive disruption at 73% efficiency. Commander Chen allowed herself a slight smile. This was why humanity had survived countless cosmic challenges, not through brute force, but through an unparalleled ability to turn the most mundane human invention, paperwork, into a weapon of unprecedented sophistication. The psychological warfare reached its peak. The Zarn found themselves drowning in a sea of perfect, technically accurate documentation that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Each attempted response only generated more complexity, more challenge, more pure administrative chaos. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause. The Zarn interceptor hung motionless, its crew watching in growing horror as their boarding team was consumed by a tsunami of human bureaucratic creativity. This was humanity's true strength, the ability to transform the most boring of human inventions into a weapon of pure psychological devastation. The psychological warfare had begun, and the Zarn had no idea what was coming next. The moment the Zarn inspector's multifaceted eyes focused on the suspicious cargo container, Commander Sarah Chen knew the real game was about to begin. What appeared to be a simple shipping unit was anything but ordinary. It was a quantum-state legal nightmare waiting to be unleashed. Contraband detection protocols activated. Araya announced, her voice a mixture of anticipation and sardonic humor. The container looked innocuous. Standard titanium alloy construction, sealed with interstellar shipping seals that appeared perfectly legitimate. But legitimacy was the first layer of the trap. Inspector Xadel's specialized scanning equipment began its methodical probe. Quantum resonance scanners, molecular composition analyzers, cross-dimensional regulatory checkers, all the most advanced inspection technologies the Zarn Collective could produce were focused on this single container. What they didn't realize was that the container itself was a weapon. As the first scanner beam touched the container's surface, it began to shift. Not physically, that would be too simple. Instead, its entire legal and physical classification began to mutate. Was it a weapon? A piece of scientific equipment? An art installation? A data storage device? The more the Zarn tried to classify it, the more it resisted classification. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez watched from the secondary control station, his fingers dancing across quantum-entangled interfaces. "Observe," he whispered to a junior officer, "the art of regulatory uncertainty." The container existed in a state of quantum legal ambiguity. Its composition changed at the subatomic level with each attempt to scan or categorize it. Molecular structures rearranged themselves, creating a living document of pure administrative complexity. Zarn regulations had thousands of pages dedicated to cargo inspection. Humans had found a way to turn those very regulations into a defensive mechanism. Initiating comprehensive regulatory defense, ARIA continued. Probability of successful classification, 0.000003%. The container began to project holographic documentation. Legal citations from a dozen different star systems materialized in the air, creating a three-dimensional web of regulatory complexity. Each citation was simultaneously true and false, existing in a state of perfect bureaucratic uncertainty. Inspector Xadel's neural processors began to overheat. This wasn't just a container. It was a philosophical challenge to the entire concept of interstellar regulation. Layers of documentation began to unfold. Some were shipping manifests that referenced historical events that hadn't occurred yet. Others were legal arguments so complex that they seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. A few were pure mathematical poetry, regulations that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. The junior officer watching with Rodriguez couldn't help but whisper, "Is this even possible?" Rodriguez's smile was razor-sharp. Humanity specializes in the impossible. The container continued its elaborate dance of legal and physical mutation. Scanning beams that should have provided clear answers only generated more questions. Its very existence was a challenge to the Zarn's understanding of reality. Proximity sensors began to go wild. The container seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, its quantum state defying standard computational models. Was it even a physical object anymore, or had it transformed into something else entirely? Araya's voice cut through the growing confusion. Regulatory complexity at maximum efficiency, initiating advanced uncertainty protocols. The holographic documentation began to pulse with an almost living energy. Legal citations twisted and reformed, creating logical paradoxes that threatened to overload the Zarn's cognitive systems. Each attempt to understand the container only made it more incomprehensible. "Impossible," muttered one of the Zarn inspectors, his crystalline form beginning to vibrate with computational stress. But the Maverick specialized in the impossible. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause. The Zarn interceptor hung motionless, its crew watching in growing horror as their boarding team was consumed by a tsunami of human bureaucratic creativity. The contraband gambit had begun, and the Zarn had no idea what was coming next. This was humanity's true strength, the ability to turn the most mundane of human inventions into a weapon of pure administrative devastation. News of the Maverick's extraordinary defense spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Information networks buzzed with recordings, legal analyses, and increasingly wild interpretations of how a single human vessel had brought the mighty Zarn Collective to its knees through pure bureaucratic warfare. In backwater space stations, on forgotten colony worlds, and in the underground communication networks of marginalized species, something unprecedented began to happen. The human approach to resistance was spreading like a viral idea, a mimetic weapon more powerful than any physical armament. Commander Sarah Chen watched the developing situation from the Maverick's bridge, a holographic display tracking the exponential spread of what Dr. Marcus Rodriguez had dubbed the Regulatory Resistance Protocol. It's more than a defensive strategy, Rodriguez explained to a group of junior officers. It's a cultural revolution. Oppressed species began to study human administrative tactics with religious fervor. The Xilnak resistance movement, long crushed under the bureaucratic heel of the Galactic Regulatory Council, were the first to fully adopt the human approach. Their communication networks began to transform, adopting the complex, multi-dimensional approach to information that humans had pioneered. Araya, the ship's AI, began tracking the spread of the resistance. Each new adoption was logged, analyzed, categorized, and celebrated. Cultural infiltration at 47% efficiency, Araya announced. Bureaucratic complexity spreading exponentially. On the mining colonies of the Proxima Arm, workers began to use human-inspired documentation techniques to resist corporate exploitation. Shipping manifestos became living documents of resistance, each line a potential weapon of administrative warfare. The Galactic Regulatory Council watched in growing horror. What had begun as a simple boarding inspection of a human vessel had transformed into something far more dangerous. Humanity wasn't just resisting. They were teaching others how to resist. Rodriguez pulled up a holographic display showing the spread of the resistance. It looked like a living organism, tendrils of bureaucratic complexity spreading across star systems, consuming traditional regulatory structures. Observe the beauty of information as a weapon, he told a junior officer. The display showed how different species were adapting the human approach, each adding their own cultural nuances to the concept of bureaucratic resistance. The Zarn Collective's communication networks began to fragment. Their perfectly ordered system of control was being challenged by something they couldn't quantify or predict. Humans had discovered the ultimate weapon, the ability to turn administrative complexity into a form of cultural revolution. On distant space stations, in hidden communication nodes, species began to share techniques. Legal citations became a new form of communication, a way to resist and challenge existing power structures. What the Galactic Regulatory Council saw as chaos. The Galactic Regulatory Council dispatched their most feared inspection team, the Omega Compliance Squadron. Cybernetically enhanced legal experts trained to break down any resistance, they were the ultimate weapon of bureaucratic enforcement. 5 beings from 5 different species, each augmented with the most advanced computational implants in the known universe, selected specifically to dismantle the human vessel's defensive capabilities. Commander Sarah Chen watched their approach with a predatory calm that would have terrified lesser beings. "Araya," she called softly, "prepare the welcome package." The ship's advanced regulatory intelligence algorithm hummed to life, quantum processors spinning up to generate what could only be described as an administrative nightmare. The Omega Squadron's approach was precision itself, a mathematical ballet of regulatory enforcement that had crushed thousands of vessels across the galaxy. They had no idea what was coming. The first wave of their inspection began with surgical precision. Quantum scanners probed the Maverick's exterior, searching for the slightest regulatory weakness. Each team member represented a different specialization of galactic law, spatial transportation regulations, quantum cargo protocols, interspecies trading guidelines, energy transfer statutes, and cross-dimensional administrative compliance. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez watched the incoming teams approach, his fingers dancing across quantum-entangled interfaces. "They think they're precise," he muttered. "We'll show them true precision." The Maverick's internal systems began to pulse with a rhythm that was part mathematical algorithm, part living organism. Walls began to shift, creating corridors that existed in a state of quantum regulatory uncertainty. Each movement was a perfect, technically accurate reconfiguration that violated every known principle of ship design. The lead inspector, a crystalline being from the Zorn Collective, initiated primary scanning protocols. Millions of computational threads began to parse the ship's systems, searching for any potential violation. They found everything and nothing. Every scan revealed a perfect regulatory compliance that was simultaneously a complete violation of every known standard. Cargo manifests referenced regulations that existed in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Technical specifications existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, perfectly legal and completely prohibited at the exact same moment. Initiating comprehensive regulatory analysis, the lead inspector announced, its voice a perfect blend of mechanical precision and growing uncertainty. Araya's response was a cascading wave of documentation that would make even the most hardened legal expert question their understanding of reality. Holographic displays erupted throughout the ship, each one a living, breathing legal argument that seemed to move and breathe with its own sentience. The Omega Squadron found themselves walking through corridors that were simultaneously cargo holds, administrative centers, research facilities, and something else entirely. Each step triggered a new layer of regulatory complexity. "Impossible," muttered one of the inspectors, its neural interface beginning to overheat. Rodriguez allowed himself a slight smile. "Impossible is just a failure of imagination." The ship's internal systems continued their relentless assault. Some areas of the vessel existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Cargo containers transformed into living legal arguments. Walls became documentation that could be read, interpreted, and challenged. The Omega Squadron's computational power began to fracture. They were experiencing something unprecedented, a form of resistance that targeted the very core of their understanding of regulatory compliance. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause. The inspection vessel hung motionless, its crew watching in growing horror as their most advanced team was consumed by a tsunami of human bureaucratic creativity. Commander Chen watched the developing chaos with a clinical precision that would have terrified her observers. This was humanity's true strength, the ability to turn the most mundane of human inventions into a weapon of pure administrative devastation. The ultimate challenge had begun, and the Omega Squadron had no idea what was coming next. The moment of true breakthrough came not with weapons, but with pure, unadulterated bureaucratic complexity. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the epicenter of a regulatory storm that would reshape the entire understanding of interstellar law. The Zorn Collective's central processing hub began to fragment, not through physical attack, but through a sustained assault of pure information. Araya, the ship's advanced regulatory intelligence algorithm, launched what would later be known as the Infinite Documentation Protocol. Trillions of legal citations, each one a perfect, technically accurate representation of interstellar regulations, began to flood every communication channel. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez watched the systematic deconstruction with a scientist's detached fascination. "Observe," he whispered to a junior officer, "how we turn paperwork into a weapon of mass cognitive destruction." The attack wasn't linear. It was a multidimensional assault that challenged the very concept of regulatory understanding. Some documentation referenced regulations that hadn't been written yet. Others cited laws from civilizations that had ceased to exist millennia ago. A few were pure mathematical poetry, legal arguments that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. The Zarn Collective's neural network began to crack. Their perfectly ordered system of control was being challenged by something they couldn't quantify or predict. Each transmission was a carefully crafted psychological trap. The legal citations weren't just text. They were living arguments that seemed to breathe and mutate. They referenced regulations that existed in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, creating logical paradoxes that threatened to tear apart the Zarn's rigid cognitive structures. Initiating comprehensive cognitive disruption, Araya announced, her voice a perfect blend of clinical precision and barely contained excitement. The first signs of breakdown appeared in the collective's peripheral communication nodes. Entire administrative sectors began to experience what could only be described as an informational breakdown. Regulatory systems that had remained unchanged for millennia suddenly found themselves drowning in a sea of perfect, technically accurate documentation. Commander Chen understood the true power of human creativity. It wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about introducing chaos into a system that believed itself to be perfectly ordered. Holographic displays across the Maverick showed the progressive breakdown. What had begun as a simple boarding inspection was now a full-scale assault on the very concept of bureaucratic control. The Zarn's primary communication hub began to fracture. Their attempts to process the incoming information only generated more complexity. Each defensive mechanism they deployed was immediately countered by a new wave of regulatory complexity. Cognitive dissonance at maximum efficiency, Araya reported. The collective is beginning to fragment. Rodriguez pulled up a holographic display showing the progressive breakdown. It looked like a living organism, bureaucratic complexity consuming the Zarn's rigid information structures from the inside out. The junior officers watched in awe as entire administrative sectors of the Zarn Collective began to collapse, not through physical destruction, but through pure, unadulterated information warfare. Outside, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause. The Zarn's massive communication arrays hung motionless, their perfect systems consumed by a tsunami of human bureaucratic creativity. This was humanity's true strength, the ability to turn the most mundane of human inventions into a weapon of pure administrative devastation. The collective was breaking, and they had no idea how to stop it. Commander Chen allowed herself the slightest of smiles. The real revolution was just beginning. In the aftermath of the most unprecedented administrative warfare in galactic history, the universe found itself fundamentally changed. The Galactic Regulatory Council chambers were no longer the pristine halls of bureaucratic control. They were now a testament to the power of human creativity. Commander Sarah Chen stood before the assembled representatives of 100 different star systems, her presence a living challenge to everything they thought they understood about power and resistance. Humanity offers not a declaration of war, she began, her voice cutting through the tense silence, but a new understanding of regulatory compliance. The holographic displays behind her told the story of the Maverick's incredible journey. Trillions of legal citations, complex administrative networks, and the complete deconstruction of the Zarn Collective's rigid information systems were laid bare for all to see. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez stepped forward, a living embodiment of the new cosmic order. What you witnessed was not an attack, he explained to the stunned representatives. It was a demonstration of the most powerful weapon in the universe, human creativity. Araya, the ship's advanced regulatory intelligence algorithm, began to project a comprehensive analysis of the administrative breakdown. What had once been seen as chaos was now revealed as a complex, living system of information warfare that had fundamentally reshaped interstellar understanding. The Zarn Collective, once the most feared administrative force in the galaxy, sat in stunned silence. Their perfect, ordered system had been dismantled not by force, but by pure, unadulterated bureaucratic complexity. We are offering a new approach to governance, Commander Chen continued. One where regulations are not tools of control, but living documents of collective understanding. The junior officers of the Maverick stood behind her, each one a testament to humanity's unique approach to challenge. They had transformed the most mundane of human inventions, paperwork, bureaucracy, administrative procedure, into a weapon of unprecedented sophistication. Holographic displays showed how different species were already adopting the human approach. Resistance movements, oppressed colonies, marginalized civilizations were using bureaucratic complexity as a form of cultural defense. What the Galactic Regulatory Council saw as chaos, these emerging societies saw as liberation. Rodriguez pulled up a final display showing the spread of what they now called the Regulatory Resistance Protocol. It looked like a living organism, tendrils of administrative complexity spreading across star systems, consuming traditional power structures. This is not about destruction, he explained. This is about transformation. The representatives from various star systems began to understand. Humanity had discovered something profound. Information could be a weapon more devastating than any physical armament. The ability to turn complexity into a form of resistance was the ultimate evolutionary advantage. Aroya's voice cut through the growing realization. A new cosmic order is emerging, one where bureaucracy is not a tool of control, but a living, breathing system of collective understanding. Outside the council chambers, the vast emptiness of space seemed to pause. The universe was witnessing a fundamental shift in how power and resistance could be understood. Commander Chen looked out over the assembled representatives. Humanity offers not conquest, she said softly, but a new way of seeing. The Maverick had done more than survive an inspection. It had started a revolution, and the galaxy would never be the same again.